So apologies in advance for my voice. I'm a little bit congested here. Might have the Wu flu. If I do, I'll be applying for a position as Jared Kushner's new coffee boy, since the old one's now the Middle East peace envoy. I'm sure he's very busy. But no, I want to talk about the way that the differences between the left and the right and how they perceive elitism. An elitism in a sense of who the elite are and what their motivations are. I think everyone's pretty much aware of the differences. Essentially, the people on our side of the right seeing a certain ethnic group as being largely responsible, and the left seeing it as simply an economic problem between the quote unquote proletariat and bourgeoisie. As much as their view may evolve over time, and I think it has, it really does boil down to that, perhaps with an anarchist twist where you break down hierarchy and that distinction evaporates, whatever it may be. It's very often I find myself whenever I discuss this with a leftist, it's very difficult to get them to understand what I'm trying to say, because of course as soon as you start to talk about the ethnic element, there's all sorts of little tricks and mental gymnastics that they try to go through to prove you wrong. And so in this video I just wanted to share my technique that I have a strategy, and I won't take full credit from this because I think I have sort of taken elements of what other people have said and put them together. But essentially I think this works very well. Now look, as soon as you say there's a Jewish element to the elite, right? The first thing you're going to be hit with, and I'm sure you've all seen this, they'll say, yeah, but they're not all Jewish, and they'll give you examples. And of course, the first names that come to mind are always Bill Gates, or you'll get the heads of the neocon movement. Oh well, to counteract Billy Crystal, they'll say someone like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and all these figureheads that everyone knows about, right? And they're right. They're right. You can say Bill Gates' father was the head of Planned Parenthood for years, but essentially they're not lying. It's only like 40% of these billionaires are Jewish. So yeah, in a sense they're not lying, and they're not incorrect. I think that there are a lot of ways that you can approach this. I know everyone listening to this has probably already come up with a couple. You can rebut it. But to respond to them in a way that they actually understand, I think, is a little bit more difficult, because it spirals into a rabbit hole, and there's this like back and forth of them trying to deny what you're saying and or misunderstanding it, and then at the end of it they just walk away with a misinterpretation of what you're saying, and they go around parroting that. So this is what I try to do, and you can go down some rabbit holes with this. But if you have some understanding of like the differences between our elite today and the elite 60 years ago, that will make it a lot easier. Excuse me. Getting a little bit sick here. So usually I'll start off by saying something like, "You believe in white supremacy, right?" You get them to admit that. You get them to define white supremacy in some way. It'll be abstract and ambiguous, of course. But you say, okay, well, you would blame white people for slavery and Jim Crow, undoubtedly, right? And of course they will, and they'll dare you to deny it. Well, but you're not going to. You're not going to deny it. In fact, you're going to say, okay, I agree. I agree that we are responsible for that. Now, did all white people vote for Jim Crow? No. In fact, I think it's only like 2%. I've heard that number before, but I could be wrong. I think it's only about 2% of households in the United States, or perhaps it was in the southern states, actually owned slaves. So it was really just our elite that were responsible for that. And in the same way, the million plus Americans and Europeans who were enslaved by the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't the average Ottoman that was responsible for that. It was the elites. And so in every standard, we all sort of accept that a whole group of people can be tarred and feathered by their elites, right? Can be blamed for what their elites do. But in a sense, we don't consider oppression by our own elites the same as by others. So for instance, black people in America and in the UK, they will blame white people or white aristocrats for their enslavement, but you never ever hear them talk about the Ethiopian kings, and I know the proper term for it, but with my accent I'm not going to say it. I don't want this video to get flagged. They never blame the Libyans. They might talk about it in passing in sort of cold terms, but there's never emotion behind it. And look, I know propaganda plays a huge part in that, but it's never considered. It's never, and maybe in Africa and on the continent itself it's a little bit different, but it's interesting that this is not something they ever bring up or ever want to talk about. So, in the same way, 60 years ago, in the 1950s and I think 60s as well, maybe even a little bit later in many parts, you had this sort of like elite, and by elite I mean people who were more than upper class, who had descended past the middle class, I can afford a nice house, I'm a lawyer, doctor kind of thing. The millionaires, right? These people, even on a local level, they would perform acts of philanthropy that you really don't see much anymore. And maybe this is just me, but I seem to find, and nobody seems to deny this, that you find all these libraries and schools and these community centers that have been built by people who made millions of dollars doing whatever in the community, right? But they didn't just keep their money or sit on it or just pass all of it down to their children. Oftentimes they would reinvest it in the community because they wanted the people around them to enjoy a better standard of living as well. And so you get all of these buildings that are named after these people that have, of course, long since died. And to a degree, the government will keep them up and maintain them. But I don't see any of this new infrastructure being built. I don't see any new philanthropists doing this. And I say that is because the ethnic makeup of our elites has changed. I think that's a big part of it. Because what they do perform philanthropy in their own, they would say, in their own eyes, by giving money to like the SPLC or the ADL or some Open Borders Foundation. Now, of course, this is not contributing to any specific community. Oftentimes, it's undermining communities. But think about it from this standpoint. Just as those libraries and those schools help to enrich the people in those communities, our people, right, the people of the elite, the same ethnic stock of the elite, so too do these acts of quote-unquote philanthropy help to enrich their people. Because it's not just benefiting the billionaires to break apart the group cohesion of a nation or to make these communities more alienated or to deracinate them. It also makes it easier for the middle guy, right? If you're someone who is outside of the ethnic community in your area, it might make it more difficult for you to get a job if people are hiring their own based on race, right? But it gives you an edge when you're the only people who are doing that and everyone else is just hiring based on merit. So essentially, in that way, their philanthropy is uplifting the lower and middle classes of their own people, and at the expense of our people, of course. But it is philanthropy in the sense of they are focusing on their group. You understand? So I'm just trying to draw parallels between these elites, because they will try to bring it always back to class. It's always back to class, but it's important to point out the distinctions between these things. And then you can say, I believe in white supremacy. I believe that is not I'm not saying I believe in the ideology, but I believe that it is a thing that exists by the way that you define it. You can admit that and you can concede to that, right? But you then have to say, okay, if we are responsible for what our elites do, then can't these people be held to the same standard? Can't I say that they're responsible for what their elites do and the consequences of their actions and how they spend their money and how they do business? Can't I apply that standard to them? And you can even draw parallels between the way that the left used to expand their anti-colonialism stance to include Israel. Excuse me. I'm actually surprised if you talk to leftists, particularly in the fringe, people who are not really mainstream, not promoted by algorithms on tech companies like YouTube. I actually do find that there is a fairly strong anti-Israel sentiment, but it's largely suppressed. They don't allow it really in their open discussions in their communities. But these people still do exist. There are still principled anti-colonialist leftists. And so I think that it's, you can really see how this works, right? They become anti-colonialist because they're anti-American, really. That's how it started. It was a form of anti-Americanism. And then by extension, they say, well, if we care about colonialism as a principle, then we should apply that to the plight of the Palestinians, the people in Gaza and the West Bank, and so on. And their struggle against Israel as an occupying force. And so in the same way, you can say, look, if I'm going to agree to your standard of blaming a whole group, of laying guilt on a whole group on the basis of what their elites do, then we have to apply this standard across the board. You believe in equality, right? Well, this has to be it. You have to hold all people to the same standard. And you can say this is sort of an abstract way of thinking, but if you're going to entertain these abstractions, you have to be consistent in it. And I find that is very direct and it's very effective because you're playing on a moral paradigm that already exists in their mind. They already think this way. And so you're just taking the way that they think about us and applying it to another group and saying, well, we're no different than them, right? And it's very hard for them to deny at any step of this what you're saying because it pertains to their ideology so well. And I mean, again, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes with this, but I just find the strategy in general is very effective, not necessarily at winning them over, but in getting them to understand where you're coming from. Remember, this is like a slow process. I used to do this a lot. I find a lot of people on our side, they get overzealous or overexcited and they want to throw a lot of information at someone all at once and it just overloads them and they shut down. Or you try to you try to interject like an opinion at them that they're not ready for, and that just sort of kills the conversation when they're not ready for that. And I've actually done that recently, and I realized I did it, and I was like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Even though I'm totally not sorry, and I don't regret it at all, right? But I'm sorry that I shut down the conversation by saying something I probably shouldn't. So I think maybe this could work in the future. Anyone who watches this video, if you think there's something wrong with my take with this strategy, or you have ways to improve it or anything, please leave a comment and maybe correct me, and if I think there's anything wrong with it or I make some addendum to this, I'll put that in the comment section myself, just as a means of updating it and making sure that this is a viable strategy. So yeah, thank you for listening, and have a good night.